Somewhere in the Skies is brought to you by HelloFresh. Delicious, healthy food delivered to your door and made in your kitchen. Next time you're listening to the show while preparing your HelloFresh meal, visit HelloFresh.ca and use the promo code Somewhere50 for 50% off your first box. Courtesy of your friends at the Antica Podcast Network and HelloFresh.
Unfathomable, a podcast about UFOs and human evidence, tells the stories of close encounter witnesses in their own words. No interpretation, no debunking, no middleman. To listen, subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. And for information on how to share your story, find us on the web at unfathomablecast.com.
Hey guys, Ryan Sprague here. As you all know, the Somewhere in the Skies podcast is always free to consume, but it isn't free to create. That's why I've started this Somewhere in the Skies Patreon campaign. On a monthly basis, you give what you think the show is worth. You'll be helping the show continue, grow, and to be something truly communal. And remember, there are rewards for each level of contribution, and the list is only growing. So please, help Somewhere in the Skies now by becoming a patron. To contribute and to learn more, visit www.patreon.com/somewhereskies. Thank you for your support. And now, on with the show.
This is Somewhere in the Skies with Ryan Sprague.
Welcome to Somewhere in the Skies. I'm your host, Ryan Sprague. I saw what I believe to have been a UFO when I was 12 years old. That event clearly had a huge impact on me and how my life played out ever since. And this got me thinking about a topic that I haven't covered yet on the show, and that's childhood UFO encounters. We often ignore the small voices of children, brushing their words off as pure imagination. But when the eyes of hundreds of children witness a UFO at the same time, it's hard to ignore that something is going on. Is it merely children making up stories? A mass hysteria running through their impressionable minds? Or are there actually intelligences from other planets visiting these children to attempt communication when adults simply can't or won't listen? Today, I speak with Michael Huntington about some of the most interesting and bizarre cases of children and UFOs, stretching back almost a century and all across the world. Michael is a paranormal travel writer and UFO researcher living in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Each year, he travels with his wife and 2 young boys to dozens of strange and interesting locations throughout America, chronicling their adventures in blog form known as Strange Travels. Michael has researched the UFO mystery for over 40 years and frequently writes on issues related to the reform of ufology and improving rational methodology. He has been interviewed on television and numerous radio programs discussing a variety of paranormal topics, his family's unusual travels, and the enigmatic UFO subject. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with Michael Huntington. There is a topic within the UFO subset that I've wanted to cover for a while now, and I couldn't think of a better person to bring on to sort of hash this out with me. We're going to overview some of the most famous child UFO cases in UFO history. Like I said, this is a subset of sightings that often gets overlooked, and now what I find, as I'm sure you do, Michael, is that children usually are honest. You know, they're innocent bystanders when it comes to this topic. So, again, usually you're getting this unfettered, sort of uncensored account when children have a UFO sighting or encounter. And those encounters are often very dramatic. And what I didn't know personally is that there are many more cases that I first thought could be lumped into this category. There's so many of them out there. So I'd love to go through a bunch of those today. My guest is Michael Huntington. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today, man.
Oh, it's always great to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to discussing these cases. They're definitely interesting, and I think it might surprise people with what we came up with here.
I think so. Like we'd been talking about earlier, there's a lot of literature and documentaries that are going to be coming out soon about this very topic of children and UFOs and why so many kids have seen UFOs throughout the years. So I think it's very appropriate that we kind of run through this and, get that out there so people can look into it before all of this really stunning revelations and documentation of these come out. So again, thank you. I guess we sort of have to start really early on. And one of the first cases that you and I came across was the 1917 Fatima sighting in Portugal. While many believe this to be a religious experience, the actual accounts were very similar to a UFO sighting, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe you could sort of run us through this and get us started on child encounters with UFOs.
Yeah, definitely. And before we jump into this, I would want to say that you're absolutely right. This is just skimming the surface of these type of encounters. And we're going to try to focus on, some of the better documented ones, the ones with a lot of witnesses, but there are certainly hundreds, if not thousands of other cases out there just involving children. And really a good place to start would be 100 years ago in Fatima. And you're right. When people look at this story, this account, it's definitely viewed as a religious miracle. And it can certainly be viewed through that angle. In fact, all the participants viewed it through, a rural peasant Catholic viewpoint when they tried to interpret what was an unusual series of events involving lights in the sky and people coming down from the lights and giving messages, which, even if you separate the religious aspect, you at least have on some level, if there was indeed an incident, pretty much a classic encounter. In 1917, what this began around was 3 children, and they were peasant sheep herders. They were like 7 or 8 years of age, and they were looking after their flock, and they had a series of lights come down from the sky, and glowing beings, which they viewed as angels, and the Virgin Mary came out and gave messages. And there was I think 5 events that took place over the course of that year, and it became engulfed, by the local Catholics in the area as a miracle. And towards the latter parts of these encounters, there were possibly tens of thousands of witnesses to strange happenings in the sky.
Whew.
Now,
talk about a mass sighting.
Yes, I think some numbers for the October 13th encounter, which was called the Miracle of the Sun, had somewhere 70,000 witnesses.
Wow.
Whether or not we could attribute this to some sort of religious mass hysteria coupled with, some sort of atmospheric phenomenon, that's sort of separate from, the issue as to whether or not something happened. And there's a lot to suggest that there was, at least at the outset with these children, some sort of physical event, some sort of actual, glowing craft, with lightning shooting out of it. We get a lot of the elements here that went on into some of the contactee stories. These children ended up becoming saints. They're on their way to be becoming saints. They ended up going into the clergy because of this miracle, and they had revelations that they got from these angels relative to a lot of the contactee messages of let's end war, let's work together, sort of the utopian vision of what Earth should be. So it's really an intriguing case, and it's a good kickoff to looking at cases that involve kids, because they definitely have had their impact, and this is a good one to start with.
I think so, and children are so susceptible at first, when these kids clearly were raised pretty religious, I would assume, at this time, that they would perceive this as a miracle, that this was the Fatima. And I think that's pretty interesting. We do hear this a lot, that people who have UFO sightings, a lot of them consider it a religious experience. And I'm sure some of the other cases involve that as well that we'll go through. But yeah, let's fast forward, Michael, to what do we got next? We've got 1952. Now, this is a case that I covered on a Patreon bonus episode of Somewhere in the Skies, and that's the Flatwoods Monster. By far, one of the most incredible cases out there, one of my favorites. And it's pretty well known in West Virginia, where this happened, but to many monster and UFO hunters, it involved both of these things. So you got to tell us a little bit more about what you know about the Flatwoods Monster, Michael.
Yeah, the Flatwoods Monster is one of my favorite cases, because it's just so weird. It's
Yeah.
it's got 10-foot tall creatures and weird saucers and government men coming in to, hush everybody up. So it's got all those sort of, classic elements that you would find in any sort of science fiction film. But Flatwoods, when it happened, in September 12, 1952, that the time period of the 50s was starting to, get that science fiction element, influenced within the culture. You were starting to get a lot of sort of science fiction ideas there in the culture. And so when this story came out, it was definitely picked up by the media. And 52, that period, everybody was saucer crazy. And this story became one of the most famous ones of its time, because it was all over the media. And even Blue Book looked into it, and pretty much all the researchers of the time period had opinions on this case. And what it was is on the evening of September 12th at around 7, there were some kids playing football, late night football. Right around sunset. Kids will do that until their parents yell at them to come home. And there were some kids playing in the school's football field, and they witnessed an object like some sort of fireball or reddish ball fly overhead and go into some of the nearby fields. So as any group of kids that would witness something like that, you're going to start running, going towards it. At least the braver kids.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there's some kids that said, "Oh, nope, time to go home."
Yeah, that would be me. Not gonna lie.
Right, but some of them did venture up towards where this object presumably came down, and collected a couple other kids along the way, maybe, and got an adult with them. But yeah, I think it was Edward and Freddie May, and then Tommy Heyer and Neil Nunley and Ronnie Shaver and Eugene Lemon, along with Kathleen May, who was the one adult. They all climbed over a fence and went into the Bailey Fisher farm where they thought it went down. So, it started to get dark. They're going up here in the dark. There's a group of them. They're all kind of excited, and they're moving up towards what they perceive to be an object, some sort of maybe car or truck sized object, kind of an orange reddish pear, smoke coming off of it, sort of hissing, flying saucer, meteor, who knows? They were all kind of frightened. They noticed it kind of smelled weird, like, some sort of diesel fuel or some sort of chemical smell. There was sort of a weird mist all around. Yet they ventured closer to try to get a better view. And as they approached, they saw a creature about 10 feet tall with big yellowish eyes and a big red circular head and some sort of big, apparatus around its head, possibly some sort of helmet or whatever, and, a long metallic skirt and little, spindly hands. And they were stopped dead in their tracks and ran away, flew back home, and, did what normal people would do. They would, call the police and from there you get your, typical response. Of course, nothing's going to be there when you get there. Maybe a little bit of weird, slime on the ground, maybe a little bit of mist left over, sort of a weird smell, but, nothing was there when the police investigated. And as with these cases at the time, the local military did take interest. You had National Guardsmen out there looking to see if there's anything out there that they need to be concerned with, and there was nothing. So ultimately, due to the lack of evidence, the government, or I don't know, maybe there was evidence, maybe it was covered up, who knows? But it sort of has been labeled as a meteor event, that a meteor came down, although I would think that there would still be a meteor there, so that doesn't kind of, really wash. What happened there? Who knows? Maybe some sort of, actual, geological event, maybe some sort of craft, maybe some sort of hallucination connected with, that gas. Who knows? But it's definitely an interesting case. Maybe kids are more open to see this sort of thing. Maybe, although the one adult that was with them was certain that she saw the same thing. So it's one of the best mysteries to out there.
Yeah, and I mean, even up until today, people still celebrate this encounter there. I mean, you've got like a Flatwoods Festival every year, and that's another interesting thing is how towns embrace these things. I know you and I have talked about this in the past, is when these things happen, they ultimately become the history of these towns, and sometimes the only history of these towns that ever make it out to the mainstream.
Yeah. And Flatwoods is one of those stories that sort of ebbs and flows with, the culture and, how it's perceived. Definitely, I think people will find even more interest here. Our friend Seth Breedlove's doing a Flatwoods movie. Mm-hmm. So, when his documentary hits, I think that'll add a lot of more interest into this intriguing case, which still remains a mystery.
Up until this day. Well, I mean, the next one we're going to cover, man, this is going to bring us way across the ocean, and it's perhaps one of the first school sightings that involved a mass sighting, and this happened in Melbourne, Australia in 1966. So can you tell us a little bit about the Westall encounter?
Yeah, the Westall encounter is probably one of the more, if not the most famous mass school encounter sightings, and it is pretty much the template for for a lot of these type of encounters. There's so much that's been done on this subject, and it stands as the best because there's so many witnesses that have come forward. There's been a lot of great solid research. Shane Ryan down there is pretty much continued to work this story, and he's probably the best guy to talk to on this subject because there was definitely something there on that day.
I stood there absolutely transfixed and saw the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life, and it took a while for me to sort of comprehend what I was actually looking at because I'd never seen anything like that before.
There was three. The one that was closer was just in the sky, just sitting there, and then it went down, came up, and then banked on its side and took off really, really fast.
It was moving away, so it had lifted off with the oval, and it was moving away from us, and we just were gobsmacked, started chasing it, and my girlfriend and I sat on the fence, climbed up the fence and just sat there and cried. We thought it was the end of the world.
When I came down into the paddock where the kids had seen this thing land, the paddock grass was about knee high, and as I walked through with pushing my bike with my uncle, I saw a group of about 20 people all huddled around looking at the ground, all looking at a circle, perfect circle. It was probably about 4 or 5 metres in diameter. The edge of the circle was perfectly formed. It wasn't as if you could, cows or any other animals or even the kids had come in and just rolled around. It was too perfect.
I mean, I know what I saw, and in fact, I don't expect them to believe me because when it happened, I didn't believe what I was seeing because it wasn't possible. What I was seeing wasn't possible.
And it was on April 6th in 1966, and there were some there were some kids that were outside, presumably for recess or maybe a field day, and they witnessed a couple of flying saucers. Your classic silvery two-disc objects, flying over their school. And as any large group of children would do, they became excited and, screamed and yelled. And there were hundreds of witnesses to this. Pretty much, I guess, the whole school soon learned of the objects outside, and everybody pretty much left their classrooms to run outside and run towards the objects, which had flown overhead. There were, I guess, airplanes surrounding a couple of these objects at some point. Some sort of a single-engine prop plane, maybe like a Cessna or a Piper or something. More than likely a civilian type craft. And some of the kids noticed, I guess, that at least one of the objects or some of the objects went behind towards a wooded area called the Grange, adjacent to the school property. There was a kind of an unused field area where a lot of the kids had hung out. Some of the children had reported that something had landed out there. There were so many different reports like that it sort of makes this event, uncontrovertible as to whether or not something happened. Something certainly happened, to have so many witnesses, whether it was, a military sort of thing. It's interesting that so much has been covered up. I mean, a lot of the, the news stories and reports just sort of disappeared, and a lot of the paperwork, even though they were definitely on location for that event within the following days. It's definitely intriguing. It's more so than any of the other experience or encounters. It has sort of the conspiracy aspect to it, the cover-up element more so than any other.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I mean, well, in terms of the actual encounter, Michael, we had another one that happened that same year. This is back in the United States in Miami, Florida. This is an Opalaka sighting. Could you tell us a little bit about this one?
I could tell you in short that at the Crestview School in Opalaka, Florida, April 7th, 1967, just, the following year after Westall, pretty much almost the exact same thing that happened in Westall happened there at Opalaka.
Right.
To some degree, if it may have lasted actually a series of days, but same sort of instance as with Westall. A group of kids spot an object. They rush towards the object, and teachers and large groups of kids, again, in the hundreds here, just as there was in Westall, along with teachers, witness an object just beyond the perimeter of the school in sort of a wood, swampy field area. They witness an object, or maybe even multiple objects, sort of flying around in the distance, through the air, throughout the trees, and who knows? It's very similar to Westall, which it really makes it intriguing, and it became a big story for its time period, probably because of the National Enquirer, which was literally based down the street from, where the school was in Lantana, Florida. So, they definitely pushed the media on this. And it was pushed at that time period. It became a national story, but it sort of died down when the Navy, the Coast Guard, actually, as well as the Navy and NASA and some of the other nearby facilities, initially pushed it off as helicopters doing maneuvers, and then followed by flares. And, that sort of outraged a lot of the witnesses in the community, because by that time, within a few days of the school event, other people had seen other objects throughout that area. So that sort of, infuriated the townspeople, when those explanations came forth. And the Navy even did a demonstrative flare drop to try to show that what the people had seen was flares, very similar to what would be tried later in Phoenix.
Phoenix Lights. Yeah.
So is this maybe one of the first instances where flares were dropped to dissuade UFO sightings? It's quite possible, but
you have to wonder, with all of these mass sightings happening, how many weather balloons and flares do the military have in stock ready to go when these things happen? You do have to wonder.
Yeah, and these people, in these communities, it's not so much that they were minding, being called liars, which I'm sure they didn't appreciate, but they live next to military installations. They're not stupid.
Yeah.
I think they were more offended by that. We know what a Coast Guard helicopter looks like,
Right.
So similar sort of thing in Gulf Breeze and some of these other, military aviation communities, mundane explanations for what these witnesses are seeing. It just, really doesn't hold water.
Yeah, it's pretty offensive if you ask me. Well, the next one that we decided to cover, Michael, was the one in Connecticut. Now, this was at Camp Delaware, and this brings us up a mountain with some young hikers. So we're moving away from schools. We're moving into the woods. So could you tell us a little bit about this 1976 sighting? I really found this one interesting.
Yeah, even within, child encounter cases, there's sort of this, Boy Scout in the woods sort of encounter idea that has been demonstrated throughout, the history of the subject. Even back in '52 with the famous Florida Scoutmaster, where, a Scoutmaster and his little group, sees something in the forest and the Scoutmaster gets burnt or whatever, so that sort of story was around even in the early 50s. And Camp Delaware is a very similar sort of account along this line. It was a group of hikers. They were about, I guess, probably like 14 or 15 of them. 14, and then their hike master. They were teenagers, 14, 15 years of age, and they were hiking near Camp Delaware in Winston, Connecticut, in 1976. This was July 28th. They were part of a camp program, and they were hiking towards Blueberry Hill, which was a nearby feature, a pretty decent hike. And as they neared an area with a bit of a clearing, they could see an object come down that was a saucer with a red dome, as it was described. And, of course, they all stopped in their tracks, and, they pointed, and I don't know if anybody took any pictures. I haven't heard of any pictures being taken, but supposedly the object had dipped down, and it landed possibly behind some trees, and the kids they ran back. They went to the police, and it was investigated, and it was investigated as credible, not just because the counselors saw it, just maybe from the fact that they were scouts, and these kids were, not the sort that are going to lie together, to the police. So, they got a lot of credibility just from the fact that, they were, I guess, sort of model citizens for that time period. But it became a case that was investigated by APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, which was one of the leading groups in the 60s and in the 70s. And they did a thorough investigation. They investigated the area. There were no trace evidence found, but from the veracity of the witnesses, and these are teenagers. These are older than some of these other accounts where the kids have been around 10 or even younger. When you get to teenagers, the credibility goes up a little bit, especially if there's an adult involved, because less likelihood of some sort of practical joke. Not that those don't occur, but this case, the Camp Delaware case, was considered one of the better cases of the year.
And I mean, you have to wonder what kind of badge they have for UFO hunting for these Boy Scouts. I think they definitely would have gotten that one. Wow. That's really interesting, and you bring up some good points. Like these kids wouldn't. Why would they make this up? You know, you learn so many good things when you're going through the Boy Scout, thing. I did that growing up as well, and they teach you to be honest. So to have made this up, I don't see it happening, and to have an adult witness this as well, they definitely saw something. So that's interesting. Well, let's move across the pond this time, Michael, and we're going to Broadhaven. This is in Wales. Same year, a year later, 1977. And this is one of the more dramatic encounters that bore a striking resemblance to another case that we're going to talk about shortly, one of the most famous. So could you tell us a little about this case out of Wales?
Yeah, Broadhaven, February 4th, 1977. It was the Broadhaven School. I guess it was in the morning, or I'm trying to think of what time of the day it was, but same sort of deal with a lot of these other cases. The kids notice out through the window something, or they're on the playground and they notice something, and they all sort of, as a group, sort of vacate what they're there to do, that day, to run outside and witness, what they think is a flying saucer landing in a field nearby the school. And the same thing happened here to a class full of kids in this small Welsh town. Kids were around the age of 10, and they witnessed some sort of like silvery object with like a red light. I don't know if it was intermittent or if it was solid, but they definitely perceived, saw the red light. That's what got their attention. And they witnessed this object go down, nearby where the school is. So, wanting to get a closer look, they do, and they see an object, and they see nearby, I guess, what is some sort of silvery being of some kind, some sort of a robot or a creature or whatever. Yeah, definitely weird. When kids start seeing robots, that's really when it starts to get interesting, because it always seems to be the children. Well, not always. But the kids that definitely, I think, are more prone to see robotic type beings. Which I don't know what that means. Maybe there's some sort of psychological component, related to children, how they're perceiving and the phenomena, or maybe, there was just coincidentally some sort of robotic creature out there. But this area in Wales, this account has sort of become a big deal. There's a whole area near Broadhaven that has been called the Broadhaven Triangle now, because so much happens within that area related to, strange phenomena, especially aerial phenomena. So, 40 years on, this case is still looked at as an important case within British ufology, and it's still celebrated, and there's still strange things going on where the event near the school happened. Now, some people have come forward saying that it might have been a hoax, not on behalf of the kids, but maybe a practical joke or a prank being conducted upon the kids by somebody else. But I don't know. That's a lot of work, to build a flying saucer, and not that it can't be done, but I'd imagine that people have better things to do with their time, and we would have heard a little bit more about such a hoax after 40 years, so
right.
Still an interesting case.
Yes, we do know that when the British hoaxed something, they definitely want it to be known, hence crop circles. I won't go any further.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, here's another one, Michael. Now, this happened in 1977, this time in West Pittsburgh, California. This is one of the most interesting because J. Allen Hynek, the man, the myth, the legend, he actually considered this one of only 3 credible humanoid encounter cases in that year. So could you tell us a little bit about this case out of my new neck of the woods, California?
Yeah, this is definitely a case that I think people should go back and take a look at. It is a Center for UFO Studies case primarily. So, you start off with a lot of good credible people involved in this case. Richard Haynes, Harder, Hynek, all these guys were involved in some sort of investigatory aspect with this case. So What happened? May 20th, 1977, West Pittsburgh, California. This is a case of three boys wanting to, enjoy some of the rural area, I guess, nearby them. I think they're actually looking to maybe, just spend a day exploring, hanging out, maybe going to the beach. They weren't really, sure what they wanted to do, but they were enjoying the outdoors. And it was Lenny Young, George Ferreira, and Patrick Morrison. And as they were hiking through the woods, getting ready to hitchhike, I think they were at one point, they encountered an object in the road, sort of a flattish saucer, maybe kind of a bluish tint to it. It looked like your classic sort of flying saucer, but it was, maybe a little squatter. It really gets strange. Soon after, they noticed that there's, some sort of beings coming out of this craft. They were sort of shadowy. They were, sort of robotic. They were kind of nondescript. They were kind of difficult to describe, but the boys all definitely claimed to have seen these beings, and that they were, sort of smoky and ethereal, yet robotic. There was a lot of mist. There was a lot of smoke that was put around the saucer as well. So definitely interesting, definitely weird. I don't think there was too much physical evidence gathered. Again, this is one of those cases where through interviewing the witnesses, looking at motivations, looking at locations, looking at consistencies within accounts, all the motivating factors that you have from interviewing witnesses, I think this became a solid case just based upon the testimony. Now, either these kids got their story, just worked out really well, or, they had a shared event. And a lot of noted researchers at the time were convinced that they had a shared event. What I think is interesting is the description of, the beings, which it is really not found anywhere else. And it's, the fact that they were kind of, nondescript and really couldn't see features, that they were shadowy, that sort of makes for interesting possibilities to consider, relative to, how these creatures are perceived again, whether or not they can change perception-wise through, the boys themselves. Who knows? It's definitely interesting.
Yeah, very unique and bizarre. And I think that's when, things start to really get interesting, and when that credibility factor kind of gets bumped up a notch, when something is so utterly different from these prototypical things we hear. A lot of these cases involve very similar things, robotic-like things, landing in the schoolyard, that. This is one of those cases, like, Hynek said, where it was so different. And like you said, it was so, concrete between these three witnesses that, yeah, definitely something strange happened. And what these creatures were, unfortunately, we'll probably never know, but interesting nonetheless. But all right, my man, here's one that when I read this description, we got to prepare the listeners for this one. We've got a three-eyed alien and a robot. So we're back to robots again. This is in our friends, the USSR. This was in 1989. So please, you got to tell us, everyone get your whiskey, you got to tell us about this one.
Well, my friend, let me tell you an old Russian story. No, I can't do the whole thing with that accent. No, this is probably when it happened. It was probably, and I remember this very distinctly, probably the top news story of the day. It was on all the newspapers, and it was a Russian task story. And, we're talking about the old Soviet Union here, even back then, government controlled. So whatever was released by the Russian government. And this story was released to the American press as a big story, throughout the world. So, the story from the motherland took place September 27th, 1989 in Voronezh, USSR. Small urban, industrial city in eastern I guess it's in Russia. You know, there's a lot of Russian states over there, and who knows where they're at now. No, but it was industrial Russian city park. You know, end of the Cold War era. You know, so everything's the way I picture everything's kind of drab and dreary. You know,
Mm-hmm.
like you see, you know, Russia in the 80s, you know, but they love their kids just like everybody else, and you know, they had parks and they enjoyed spending time outdoors. And the South Park, if we run into the South Park on this day, there was a number of kids playing, and you know, some adults and people walking by in the streets. It's a public city park, and the kids began to notice a red, maybe a pinkish red sort of object, like a circular, you know, like a cherry in the sky, just sort of coming down towards the park. And, you know, of course, everybody's pointing and looking, and their mouths are open, and they're saying stuff in Russian and screaming in Russian, I'm sure. And the object comes down and lands in the park, you know, near the playground equipment where the kids are. So I guess the kids are the closest, you know, to this object. Good size object, I guess, maybe the size of, you know, a semi truck, or, you know, somewhere halfway big enough for, you know, an 8-foot tall or a 10-foot tall robotic creature to get out of, you know, or, you know, some sort of three-eyed alien, because that's pretty much what happened.
Находился я в это время.
I was standing not far from the main road of the South Park, and I saw this flying object at an approximate height 250 meters.
It stayed at the same height and did not move horizontally. I was very interested by all that, because it could not be any kind of meteorological balloon.
There was a squeaking sound. Perhaps some drilling tool was operating, like it was boring a hole in the ground.
The creatures started coming out. They did not look too much like humans. They were much taller than humans. They did have shoulders, but I didn't see the head.
He was huge, really huge, bigger than we are. He was a mighty figure.
I remember a crowd that gathered around the place. Everybody was scared. Everybody turned pale. I was absolutely flabbergasted.
I saw some traces there, and also a strange man. Outwardly, he looked like any other man, only he was huge. A moment later, he suddenly disappeared.
I had no doubt that the UFO and the giants existed, because I saw them. But sometimes when I look back, it seems sort of like a fairy tale.
Within a few minutes, you know, the door opens, and 10-foot tall, three-eyed, strange kind of, I don't know, overall clad, metal overalls, you know, sort of a creature comes out with a little square robot next to it, and sort of looks around, and it sort of gets weird. I guess they look around, they go back in their ship, they come out, they disappear, they look around. You know, they're sort of doing this in and out thing with their flying saucer, and you know, the kids are, you know, the closest, and of course the more curious and the more adventurous, and also, you know, the dumbest. You know, they're gonna you know, approach this object and these beings, and at some point, you know, these four kids that are getting closest to the object, one of them gets zapped by a rod that the big creature, the big three-eyed, 10-foot tall guy is holding. He points it at one of the kids that's getting too close, and he sort of freezes. Mm-hmm. You know, like not frozen like with icicles hanging off him, but you know, like a suspended form of you know, paralysis. Mm-hmm. And they get back in their ship, and then, you know, at some point they take off, and you know, the kid gradually comes out of it. This whole series of events, I guess, is like maybe a half hour, 45 minutes. Certainly, it seems like that, you know, based upon all the descriptions, you know, of sequence of events. But you know, it's one of those things where it's like everybody was like, hey, there's a UFO down in the park, so the crowd had actually gotten bigger. So they're not just the kids were witness to this playground event, but upwards of maybe 50 people, or maybe even into the hundreds, had begun to move down towards this park. So and then it hit the media, and it was a big deal in Russian press and then American press. Who knows?
Man, they always gotta try to outdo us, don't they?
Yeah. And the Russians, they did their investigation and their military police and all that. Interesting, though, the Russians were actually a little more open to this sort of thing back then. So when they talked to like an investigator, some sort of general that was investigating, the general would say stuff like, "Oh, it's probably aliens from outer space." They're totally okay with saying that because it's their news service, so they can say whatever they want.
Right. Yeah. If we've learned anything from RT News, that's kind of how it goes, for sure.
Right.
All right, man. So on a more serious note, we are going to move to our final case, probably the most famous case to date. Many documentaries have covered it. There's going to be some more coming out. Even the Harvard psychiatrist, John Mack, was involved with this one. So please, to sort of cap all of these cases off for us, can you run us through the deeply dramatic Ruwa, Zimbabwe case of 1994?
Absolutely. And this is probably one of the high caliber cases in this subset of UFO investigation and history, mostly because of the quality of the investigation and the quality of the investigator involved in this. And if Dr. John Mack, who was head of the psychological department, I believe at Harvard at the time, taught at Cambridge University, really high caliber, learned man within legitimate psychiatry and psychology, began to take an interest in UFOs, not so much, with an idea of investigating the phenomena, but investigating people that claim interaction with the phenomena. Because as a psychologist and a psychiatrist, he was interested in, what they perceived, what they thought, if there was certain psychological components that he can explore. Can he deem through examination and psychoanalysis, if there was some sort of, reality to the circumstances involving, encounters with especially beings. And he would use hypnotic regression and some of the classic methods to explore that. So he was interested in the subject as a mainstream psychologist and as somebody interested in, as I had said, the psychological aspects of encounters. And so he was already on the radar. He was already out there. He had written some papers and, was under scrutiny by Harvard, relative to a big university, a legitimate university should be involved in investigating, such things. And he was ultimately given academic freedom to explore these issues. And as a result, he began to get cases thrown to him, and he was coincidentally in Zimbabwe or near there back in 1994, and he was told of this case at the aerial school in Ruwa, Zimbabwe, just outside of Harare. And he made it down there, I think within, maybe a week or two of the initial encounters, and he was able to interview and investigate more so than anybody I've heard of, a case, relatively quickly on location, after it happened.
They describe these experiences or these events like a person talks about something that has happened to them. And when you're talking with a psychotic who's telling you something and it's a delusion and you feel that it really didn't happen, I can tell. I mean, I know this is something that person wants me to believe, or they're frightened, or they're distorting reality in some way. There's nothing like that here. These are people of sound mind, by and large, telling me something that's they know that I might think they're crazy, and so they're a little concerned about telling me, and they're very full of questioning themselves and doubt, and I mean, the way, and then they describe something very real and intense, a light or something happened to their body, or it's the whole quality of the way they talk about it is the way a person talks about experience that happened to them.
What happened on September 16, 1994, there were 60 kids at this aerial school, and Zimbabwe has, had its periods of colonialism, so there were different ethnic makeups within this school, different backgrounds, white children and Indian children and African native children all attended this school. It was very, popular and organized and ordered school. And 60 of these kids this day were on the playground, and similar to, the other accounts, they witnessed, an object, like a cigar-shaped or a flying saucer-shaped object land in the fields just beyond the school grounds. And similar to, some of these other stories, they see a couple of men, and, with the big black alien bug eyes, sort of going in and out of this flying saucer, and that's what Dr. Mack had gone down here to investigate. And these kids, when he interviewed them, they told predominantly the same story, but they just had, they had little minute sort of cultural changes, cultural descriptions that were a little different, relative to, the creature's appearance or even the appearance of the craft.
Something scared you, is that right?
Yes.
What scared you?
The noise.
What noise?
The noise that we heard in the air.
You heard a noise in the
Yes.
air? What was it like? Like a roar or a buzz or a hum, or what kind of a noise?
It was like someone was blowing a flute. It was scary myself.
It was scary because you saw something yourself?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a little object hovering. It was quite big, actually, and then there was little ones all around it. We saw something silver, and then we quickly ran to the logs, and we saw a silver thing, and we saw a man standing next to it.
What did it feel like when he was looking at you?
I felt scared.
It felt scared? What was scary about it?
Well, I felt scared because I've never seen such a person like that before.
Was he near the silver object, or was he far from
No,
it?
on top.
On top of the silver object, okay. And did you look at him?
Yes.
Did he look at you?
Yes, then he gave me the creeps, then I stopped looking
Gave you
at
the
him.
creeps. Actually, in your drawing, you showed him standing up, didn't you?
Yes, I had to draw him standing up because I couldn't draw him sitting. What I thought was maybe the world's going to end. Maybe they're telling us the world's going to end.
That's sort of an interesting aspect. I think everybody involved, the main investigators and Dr. Mack, believed that there was some sort of encounter. And again, you start getting into the, when you investigate it, especially with children, you start to see these perceptual aspects that are kind of interesting. And for Dr. Mack, was the heart of his investigation. Some of those, for instance, like the African children who witnessed it, sort of perceived like hair, and they identified it as like a classic creature, from their culture called a togolishi, which is like some sort of like spirit or some sort of being. So, there's interesting stuff there to explore. I'm by no means an aerial expert. There are a lot of people out there that know a lot more. There are a number of documentaries coming down the road. I think Aerial Phenomena is one that is going to be coming out, and I think our friend James Fox has been doing some aerial stuff as well for his project. So and some of the children witnesses, they're grown up now, so they've taken to speaking about their encounters. Emily Trim is one. She's out there. She speaks about the encounter that she was involved with that day, and some of the kids claim further encounters, or at least messages. We sort of have that contactee aspect of receiving messages by some of the witnesses. utopian type stuff, which is fascinating.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Great
And
case.
it's a great case. And like you said, the witnesses are still willing to talk about what happened to them. And it's clear that they're still affected by this and they stick by their stories. So that's what I find most interesting about this one. It's the most current one we have to date. And it's also the one where we still have these witnesses around to tell the story. So this case is not going to die. These documentaries are only going to shine more light on it. So I'm excited to see where that goes.
Yeah.
Michael, these cases, it's astounding how many there are. And like you said right before we started, there's hundreds of more. But with all of these cases that involve children, I want to hear from you, man. In your opinion, do you think whatever is happening to these kids, do you think it's intentional by these possible intelligences? Are they actually targeting these children to appear to? Or is this all complete happenstance? Is it different for every case? Where do you sort of land in terms of why so many child UFO encounters happen?
Well, ultimately, I would say I think it's different in each case. I do think that these cases have to kind of be viewed independently of each other, but the comparisons are really striking. You can't get around that. I don't know what kids are seeing. Are they more open to that sort of thing? I would think that it's probably the personality, of whoever is perceiving, I guess, whatever is being perceived. That's sort of a long way around of saying, maybe it depends on the person, and maybe it does depend on the fact that these are children, and perception does play its part into it. I can tell you myself, though, and I think you're right along there with me, that as a person who saw an object as a kid, it definitely influenced me. It got me. It got me further interested into the subject. I don't know if a lot of these people who saw these ended up going on to, not too many of them that I've heard of have gone on to, spread the UFO message or whatnot. But at least for a time, they were vocal in the reality of what they saw. I don't know. I think, some of these cases, maybe there's some sort of misidentification. Mass hysteria is always a possibility. Hoaxes are a possibility in some instances. But all of these cases, I think, stand out in that, when you start getting into hundreds of witnesses and you start moving out of, the child demographic, and you're starting to get adult and other people seeing the same thing, then something is being seen then. Something is being experienced. Perceptions as to, beings and all that, I find very intriguing, very interesting. What's going on? I don't know.
Yeah,
that's what makes it. That's what makes these, especially interesting. And I'd love to track some more of these witnesses down to some of these cases to see how it's affected them long term, or if they've changed their mind. I think from those that have come forward, even to this day, they stand by themselves as children. This is what I saw when I was a kid.
Yep, and you can't ask for more than that from a witness. They have defied that sort of stigma that comes with reporting a UFO. They were kids, There wasn't this idea that I'm going to lose my job if I talk about this, or the Johnsons next door are going to talk about us. It's they're open, they're honest, and like you said, they're willing to be more honest than I think an adult would be in terms of coming forward with things like this. In terms of that, I have a question for you. In terms of like UFO organizations that investigate cases, do you think in terms of these cases that there should be some sort of organization that strictly deals with kids?
That's a good question. I think it's always advantageous to, have people, interested in specialized aspects of, this subject and its history. As far as an organization, I think there's a pretty good Westall group on Facebook where a lot of these cases are discussed. It's Shane Ryan, the Westall investigator down there, and he's done some other investigations into similar school type events. I think his group would probably be a good one to sort of interconnect with different people. What makes these interesting and a little more problematic logistically for having a group is, these cases are all over the world, so if we're going to interact, relative to these cases, it's probably going to have to be a cyber organization like the Westall Group. But definitely, I think it's a good area of focus. And and there's other accounts out there. Yeah, we've just hit the iceberg. The famous Delphos case was a child case. Cash Landrum was a child case.
Yep.
There's a lot of our famous cases involve children, and it would be good for somebody to look into that. I think we got a lot of good searchers like Shane out there doing that for us. So
yeah, he is doing some great work. And again, the Westall case is definitely one people should look into. Well, speaking of children, Michael, many of my listeners, they know this, but some may not. You are the host of the Strange Travels blog, and don't think you weren't going to get away without talking about this, man. This is where you chronicle your adventures across the U.S. and with your children and your wife, which, again, I envy tremendously. And you've gone to some amazing places. This past year, tell me, debrief me, have you personally been to any places that you really want to talk about? Anything strange happen or really come to mind, stick out?
Oh man, yeah, we're doing the same thing that we've been doing. I call myself a paranormal travel writer, but that's not really my job. I'm just a regular, just UFO junkie here in Missouri. But I do take my wife and kids to interesting spots, and we'll visit the occasional famous UFO place. And I like to take pictures and document and share. The big thing probably this past year, we went to Kelly, Kentucky, home of the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter of 1955, where a house was besieged by goblins.
Yep.
I'm sure everybody's familiar with it, but I went there for the eclipse, and it just so happens on the anniversary day of the eclipse was also the anniversary of the encounter.
Ooh, wow, creepy.
So, and it was also the longest duration point for the eclipse. Mm-hmm. So it was the epicenter of the eclipse at this famous UFO spot. So we had fun. We had fun there, and I got to look around. I got to go onto the grounds of the property and then stand where the goblins were and look at the trees that they leapt up into, and even saw the flying saucer or the circular patch that their saucer supposedly landed in 1955. So
wow.
that was one of the big highlights. But that's the sort of thing that we do. They have a UFO festival and all that. But we like to do a lot of the paratourism and the UFO tourism, and we go to haunted houses and Bigfoot places, and we're still doing that, and we're still blogging about it. And thank you, Ryan. I know you've been liking a lot of my stuff and complimenting me. You've been a big supporter, and I do appreciate that.
Oh, I love it, man. It's more jealousy than anything, but no, I have a great respect for what you do and that you introduce this to your children. I think that's important. You're not telling them what to think. You're not telling them what all of this is. You're introducing them to a topic that many parents would be shy away from with their children. And, we grew up having experiences, and that's what led us to do this. So I know I've asked you this on Into the Fray, but I want to ask you again, how do you deal with this with your kids? What do they take away from seeing the indentation where a possible UFO landed and goblins came out? What does a kid make of this? That would blow my freaking mind.
Well, first off, I'm jealous of my kids because when I was a kid reading about this stuff, I wanted to go there immediately. you know, and look around. And, you know, so my kids are kind of lucky in that, you know, they get to go to a lot of interesting, you know, places. And when they're there, they know what they're there for. They know that, you know, supposedly an alien was seen over there, or, you know, a Bigfoot was seen, you know, right where you're standing, whatever. And they think it's fun and they think it's interesting. Luckily they're into all this too. You know, they ask a lot of questions. I don't push, you know, hypotheses. In fact, I encourage my kids to come up with different ideas, and that's always fun. You know, when we're going through the TNT area looking for the Mothman, you know, my boys will get into a competition of theories as to what they think it really is, you know. But there's always that little bit of mystery that little kids maintain that always gives them a little bit of fright and a little bit of, you know, intrigue and a little bit of mystery, you know, within them that keeps them engaged. And my kids, luckily, they love monsters and aliens and all that, and they love going along with me and exploring as well.
That's awesome. God bless them. Well, what can we expect next? Where you guys heading this year? The year's almost wrapped up. What's coming next for you guys?
Well, we're probably gonna tool around here in Missouri, visit a couple of you know, local urban legends. You know, there's a couple of spooky haunted places and alien landing site that I need to check out before the end of the year. But next year, I think we're gonna go up to Hannibal, Missouri, visit Mark Twain's town, and have some fun up there. I think that's probably one of our big trips that we're looking to do. We're gonna go up there and maybe have my kids paint the fence, you know, in a Tom Sawyer Huck Finn competition. I think that might be on Mark, but.
That's great, man. It's not all UFOs and ghosts and goblins. You got to teach them some literature too, right?
Well, but, you know, Ryan, there's a lot of it. Also, right near there is the first Momo sighting.
Okay.
And the famous, you know, a couple famous UFO landing spots. So
I should have known.
I'm still going to take advantage of. And of course, there's haunted places in Hannibal, I'm sure. So yeah, we're going to do the weird stuff while we do our normal family stuff, you know.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Well, my man, where can we find out more about what you're doing?
Well, I am all over social media. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you know, all that good stuff. I'm usually on Facebook quite a bit, and if I'm posting something somewhere or talking on the radio somewhere, I usually put a link up there. So just look me up there, and you can follow what we're doing. I do have my WordPress blog. Just keeping at it. Still working on the book. Hopefully, we're actually expanding that, and we're going to do some art projects connected with it. But you know, when it's done, it's done. You know, we'll see how it goes. But you know, it's a lot of stuff out there. A lot of stuff you want to do, and we're keeping at it. But always interested in making more friends, and if anybody's got a cool place they want to tell me about or a cool story, I'm always good to hit up for a chat.
Awesome. That's so great to hear, man. Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating crash course and a subtopic of UFO sightings that doesn't get talked about often, and I'm so glad that this is what we landed on. I know I've wanted you on since I started the podcast, and we couldn't really nail down a topic, but I think this was a good one. We haven't talked about it before. There's clearly a lot of questions to still be asked about why all of these child UFO encounters happen, and I couldn't think of a better person to do that today, so thank you again for coming on Somewhere in the Skies.
Thank you, Ryan. It is a pleasure, and you're doing a great job with the show. Keep at it, buddy.
That is it for this week's episode. All of Michael Huntington's work can be found on Facebook and on Instagram. Just search for Huntington Strange Travels. If you really want to help out Somewhere in the Skies, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing on iTunes. It truly helps more than you know. Somewhere in the Skies is on Twitter @SomewhereSkies and on Instagram @SomewhereSkiesPod. The official merch store is open with several different designs. Visit teepublic.com and search for Somewhere in the Skies. That's teepublic.com. I will see you here next week. And remember, keep your feet on the ground, but never stop searching somewhere in the skies.
Somewhere in the Skies is produced by Third Kind Productions in association with Antica Productions and the Antica Podcast Network. To learn more, visit anticaproductions.com.
Hey, I'm Christina Roach from The Reality Check here on the Antica Podcast Network. Each week, my co-hosts and I explore a range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Find us on iTunes, your favorite podcast platform, as well as on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Until then, remember, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.